Next, just to wrap up on risk management one. So most of the time you can get away with just a policy, maybe a framework document. Like with those two documents, you can get away with that. Sometimes, for example, like in Germany, you are expected to develop a risk profile, basically to either quantify your overall risk exposure or to show how risks affect objectives, or whatever Tim Leach calls, objective-centric risk management. Again, none of this is real. It's all risk management one. So your key objective, your key purpose in doing this is you want to have something, and that something has to look pretty, but you have to make sure it takes as little time as physically possible, because none of this is real. So, if you have a strategic risk register, it doesn't matter whether you have 5 columns or 10 columns or 50 columns, your overall strategic risk register is as useless, whatever your kind of your effort that you put in into creating it. So if you spend a day creating your strategic risk register or high level risk profile, or 6 months creating the same strategic risk register with a lot more detail, it had zero value before. It still has zero value. And okay, I'm a little bit exaggerating. The value is not zero. The value is like 5 out of 100, because disclosure is still important, and showing that risk register and sending it to the central bank once a year, or sending it to the central bank once a quarter, or showing it to the audit committee once a year, it has value, and the value is keeping them happy. And what's the ultimate purpose of risk management one? It's keeping them happy and making sure that they sleep well and they're relaxed and they're satisfied and they're just generally comfortable. Comfortable, I think, is the word, comfortable. So yes, Sammy, thank you. I agree with you. Documenting risks in the risk register is not really risk management or managing risk. So at some stage, or in some countries, in some geographies, or some regulatory environments, you will be expected to develop a risk profile. A risk profile is basically a risk register, a high-level risk register, and you do not want to spend too much time on going into a lot of detail. The more you don't need to have a lot of risks in your high-level risk register, because your risk profile is judged on its existence. Do you have one? Tick. Nobody really cares in risk management one world. Nobody really cares if it's a big or a small, if it's many risks or many columns in the risk register. I mean, without a doubt, the stupidest thing I have ever seen in my life is a large multi-billion-dollar oil and gas company in Eastern Europe creating a risk register which had 53 columns. That is, without a doubt, the stupidest thing I've ever seen. I mean, the guys that were developing the methodology behind it, I think they should be prosecuted, because this is criminal. This is absolutely criminal, because risk management one has to be quick, painless, beautiful. Quick, painless, beautiful. I think that's the motto of risk management one profile. So if you are required to do a risk register, do watch my first session at the Risk Awareness Week. And Risk Awareness Week, of course, you can find, if you're watching this on LinkedIn or YouTube, Risk Awareness Week is still at 2022.riskawarenessweek.com, and all the replays are available there. And the first, literally, if you go to replays, like watch the workshops page, the first workshop is my session that I did last Monday, where I talk about 3 levels of risk analysis: basic, standardized, and advanced. Again, don't need to recreate the wheel. We just borrow the same approach that banks have been using for years under Basel regulations. So we also have 3 levels of risk analysis, and basic is all you need at the risk management 1 level, because it's more than sufficient. My key, so basically, to get a risk profile, you need to do 2 steps. Create a risk register, make it super high level, super simple, make it quantitative. Step number 2, make it quantitative. Some software packages like Archer Insight can actually do it at the push of a button. You take your normal risk register and then just converts it into a quantitative risk register, and it gives you a histogram, your risk profile, a distribution of your risk exposure. You can represent it as a histogram, or you can represent it as a loss exceedance curve, and that gives you all the valuable insights. You can prioritize using tornado diagram instead of a heat map, which is completely flawed and a waste of time. And it gives you expected losses, unexpected losses. It gives you a tail. So it gives you so expected losses. You use that for budgeting and planning purposes. Unexpected losses is your VAR. You use that for reporting purposes and prioritizing purposes. And then the tail, you can use that for insurance purposes. Again, all of this is high level, so you wouldn't really use any of this information for planning, budgeting, or insurance purposes just now, because you would want, for those specific decisions, you would actually want to do proper risk analysis. But it looks really, really good. A quantitative risk profile, quantitative risk register, it is probably the sexiest thing a risk manager can come up with. So if you are, for some weird reason, required to do a risk register within the organization, it better bloody be quantitative, because it's so easy to convert any risk register on the planet into a quantitative risk register. Nah, thank you for your question. Here's the address for the annual virtual risk awareness week. And I highly recommend anybody who's watching this right now live, or you'll be watching this later in repeat, I very much recommend signing up to that online conference. It's virtual, so you don't have to be live to watch it. You can watch it on any device at any time, and replays are available forever. There are 40 workshops on different proper risk management, quantitative risk management, 2 topics. So if you're wondering, well, how do you convert a risk register from qualitative to quantitative, well, you can just watch Hans Lisso's session and download his template. Or if you want to know how do you represent risks using an tornado diagram, you just watch Hernan's session and download his template and you use that. And there are obviously a lot of sessions on bow ties and risk appetite, but I'll be referencing them throughout the conversation. So let me just kind of run this here, and well, I don't know, it doesn't look pretty. So risk profile. This is your second last section within risk management 1. You may be required to have a risk register. If you do, I mean, if you can get out of it and don't do it because it's a waste of time, but if you can't, if you must have a risk register because somebody expects you to, it's 21st century. We have all the technology we need. There are even software packages like Archer Insight that automatically do it for you. Have a quantitative risk register. For goodness sake, it's about time we just stopped with colors and words and numbers. You can't multiply high and medium. It's just it's year 7 math. Bad math from year 7. Don't do it. The final thing in risk management 1, sometimes some external organizations expect you to have some sort of risk appetite statements, documents, words, and again, that's really easy, because there is a very simple answer in risk management 1 for it. First, if you are still confused on what is risk appetite versus tolerance, capacity, like all these buzzwords. By the way, even though I am quite young, I actually am old enough to remember when Oliver Wyman, one of the consulting companies in risk, commercialized risk appetite, because risk appetite existed forever. And then somebody turned it and decided to create a risk appetite statement, which, by the way, is the stupidest idea ever. And again, zero practical value. But we've now live in the new world where risk appetite is something that we have to waste our time doing. So if you're still confused about some of the terminology, what is what and how to use it, make sure when you sign up for the Risk Awareness Week, make sure you find David Vose's workshop, where he, I think, does a wonderful job explaining it. So just follow his lead on that. From a practical point of view, what is risk appetite? Risk appetite is three things. Number one, different legislations already set different appetites. Anti-money laundering, safety, environmental, there are limits and zero tolerances that have been imposed on the organization. And all of these limits are already documented in different board level policies and procedures. So technically speaking, you don't have to do anything. You just have to keep in mind that, whenever your policy or some sort of guideline within the organization says we have zero tolerance for fraud, well, that's your risk appetite against fraud. And whatever your safety policy says against the safety and well-being of employees, well, that's your appetite for that. So all of this has been documented well before kind of risk managers arrived in shining armor on the scene and decided to own the concept of risk appetite. So that's number one. Different legislations already imposed, and all of that has been documented and written within the organization. So there's pretty much nothing you need to do about that. The second part of risk appetite is this kind of gentleman's agreement between the shareholders, the board, and the management. And that is usually represented by deal limits. For example, anything below 10 million can be decided by the CEO. Anything above 10 million needs to go to the board. Anything above 100 million needs to go to like a special committee within the board. And so these limits, again, all you need to do is to identify them, see where they're documented, know where they are, and refer to them if you need from time to time. And so that's your second type of risk appetite. Again, the legal team and the corporate secretary have probably documented all of these kind of limits and parameters long before risk management ever needed to be involved. Maybe on some of the specific decisions, you can add a little bit of value by saying we will invest in new markets, but only, and you can add like a little sentence, but only after a thorough risk analysis has been performed and the risk is not exceeding, and the risk is considered, moderate or something. And then you can, figure out what the definition of moderate would be for your organization. So that's the second example of risk appetite. Again, most of the time you actually, as the risk manager, actually don't have to do anything because it's already been done by somebody much more competent within the organization, usually corporate secretary or the legal team. And then, of course, there is the from your risk management one perspective, I mean, I don't really see a benefit of collecting all of these appetites from different existing documents and putting it into a single risk appetite statement. I never did that. I actually did the opposite. I just referred, like whenever somebody asked me about risk appetite, I said, well, risk appetite regarding safety is in this document, risk appetite regarding investment is in this document, risk appetite regarding planning and budgeting is in this document, and so on. So I always, whenever I had a choice of creating a new risk document or making mild changes into existing corporate documents, somebody else's documents, or not even having to do any changes and just referring to those documents, I have always in my career as a CRO, as a head of risk, I always used the second option. I never created separate risk documents. I always made changes to somebody else's existing documents. So as far as risk appetite goes, most of the time you don't have to do anything about it at all. all you have to do is find where different appetites are within the existing documents, read through a few policies. Basically, take all the documents that have been approved by the board, and you will identify different limits, no-goes, zero tolerances, statements, qualifiers, and all of them collectively is your company's risk appetite. You may discover that there are some important decisions that have absolutely no limits and no rules. And then the risk manager's job may be to kind of to suggest that why don't we incorporate some of the rules around a particular new decision. And finally, the third type of risk appetite is whenever somebody is making a decision, we actually use risk management 2 to show that for most decisions, there is no single best answer. For example, when you have a portfolio of projects, there's no one best combination of projects. There are always different bad and different good combinations. There are multiple good combinations. And the kind of the preference is really subject to the decision maker's appetite for risk. For example, I remember we had an investment of whether we wanted to build a new chemical plant, and it was a choice between building a single line with large capacity or two smaller capacity lines in parallel. So basically just choosing different technological options for the plant configuration. And both of those options are good. Like one is no better than the other. They have different risks. One has more operational risk, the other one has more market risk. They're just different kinds of risk. Like one is not better than the other. They're just different flavors of risk. And so for us, the third instance of risk appetite was whenever somebody is making a big decision, we would present option A and option B with the underlying upsides and downsides, the risks, and then let the decision maker choose, because it's not for you as the risk manager to say one is better than the other. Like sometimes some choices are just bad in all scenarios, but most of the time some choices are better 90% of the time, and 10% of the time the other choices are better. And depending on what the kind of the future view, the view of the future for the shareholder is, then he may decide what is kind of more suitable for him. So for me, the third type of risk appetite, which doesn't need to be documented in the risk appetite statement, is whenever there is an important decision to be made, don't present a single scenario, present various options, show optionality, and highlight that there are different risks associated with the different options. So that's, in my mind, kind of the practical application of how we use risk appetite. And that wraps up our Risk Management 1 conversation. I mean, congratulations. With very little effort, a lot of beautiful pictures. And by the way, do look at my first session on Risk Awareness Week that I talked about different levels of risk analysis, and I talked about the basic, because I actually show a lot of beautiful pictures, and I think I have one of the pictures a little bit later as well. You can actually generate a lot of beautiful pictures for Risk Management 1. And that's it. You're done with Risk Management 1. You now have kind of a nifty package that whoever comes and asks you about risk management, you can show them, and they will be very satisfied and happy.